welcome to the sixth and final episode this season, I think.
Yes, I would assume so.
Okay, of Cleveland State University Psychology Club podcast. As always, I'm your host, Kevin, joined by
Madhva.
And on this episode, we mixed it up a little bit, and we did not talk to somebody in the field of psychology, but we talked to Dr. Michael Wiitala, who is a member of the philosophy department here at Cleveland State University. His background is in mostly ancient philosophy. He's a self-described Aristotelian. I know he has a strong background in Platonic philosophy and Neoplatonism, which we will get into if you don't know what that is. And we talked about some topics that came up earlier in this season, in particular happiness.
Yes. I'd say this podcast was very refreshing just to talk about philosophical ideas as such. I personally like thinking about ideas and talking about these ideas and investigating them in a deeper manner. And in this podcast, I was able to do that without holding these ideas to empirical evidence. Just discussing ideas on their own merit was something that was refreshing for me.
Yeah, me as well. I took ancient philosophy with him and medieval philosophy, and I'm really glad I did. I had a great time in those classes. We talked a bit about how the ancients viewed life and happiness and what a happy life is and how do you go about doing that. And it turns out that their ideas were pretty durable, which is pretty interesting, I think.
Yeah, we covered how philosophy developed over the ages, right from ancient philosophy to medieval philosophy to the cusp of enlightenment. We talked about some of the important philosophers within those periods, their ideas, and how it shaped our thinking today.
Yeah, this is definitely an episode that could have gone for a really long time, but with nothing further from us, let's just get right into it. One of the areas that you focus on in your scholarship is Aristotle. So we were wondering, why should a modern person read about Aristotle or be familiar with his work?
So I think there's a few reasons. Maybe the first is that I think Aristotle, right, this is my view, he gets a lot of things right. So if people have been asking these philosophical questions like what is happiness or what is reality ultimately for thousands of years, and I think Aristotle gets the right answer to a lot of those questions. So in that sense, he's worth studying. And then even where he doesn't get it right, I think the principles that he uses, the ways that he talks about it, his method is helpful for doing philosophy, right? Even if you come to conclusions different from his. So, I just think he has a lot to offer in both those ways.
So, what are some of the core aspects of Aristotle's philosophy that are something that could help modern person live their life better and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think the part that's most relevant for living your life better is the ethics. So he has a few books on that. Nicomachean Ethics is the most famous, and the central question there is what is happiness and how can we attain it, right? And in answering that, he develops a whole theory of virtue and so on. And I think that's the thing that's most directly practical in a way. I know in contemporary philosophy of science, you've got a lot of people who are starting to take Aristotelian metaphysics as theory of what reality and existence is, and then apply that to try to understand what we're doing in empirical science. But I guess, right, if you don't think that's super practical, then I don't know if that would count. But definitely stuff on happiness seems to me to be pretty practical, and a lot of contemporary people are working on that.
Are there any similarities to, maybe talk a little bit about what he had to say about what happiness is and how you go about attaining that, and are there any similarities between his views on that and maybe other philosophers that were around in totally different parts of the world or different regions?
Yeah, so I guess at his time, I haven't studied a lot of Confucius myself, but from what I've read, there seems to be a lot of parallel between Aristotle and Confucius. Both have a kind of socially based virtue theory. Right, so their views would actually be similar. And then at his time, of course, you've got Buddhism developing, but it has a fairly different conception of what happiness is. And, and the same with Hindu philosophy, that some of it would have been contemporary with Aristotle as well. But again, kind of going in a slightly different direction than he goes in.
And, I mean, I'm sure you could go really in depth with this, but if you could, in some way, keep it brief, relatively. I mean, how do you go about living a happy life? What's the point of all of this? According to Aristotle.
That's from Aristotelian perspective, because the thing I've seen Aristotle most associated with the phrase is virtue ethics. So if somebody was not aware of what virtue ethics is, what would be like your short version of what virtue ethics is, and how using that can we apply it to our lives in general?
Yeah, so I think kind of the short answer to this is that Aristotle, so he's concerned first of all to define happiness, and I think he defines it, or in a sense, like this is just what it means. The word that's translated as happiness in ancient Greek means is like a desirable life. So he's not thinking of happiness as kind of a momentary feeling, as like, hey, I felt good today and I was happy. He's not thinking of it that way. He's thinking of it instead as something that we aim at. Like, we want our life as a whole to be happy. And so with that understanding of happiness, he starts to ask, well, what is it about in life that would make your life as a whole happy or desirable, right? The kind of life that someone would want. And so he goes through, well, what do people think? Some people think it would be pleasure. Some people think it would be like your reputation. Some people think it's money. And he kind of goes through each of these and says, well, it doesn't really make sense that it's your reputation, because that depends on other people. It doesn't even really make sense. I mean, definitely doesn't make sense as money, because you want money so that you can get whatever you want, right? And it's not really pleasure either, he thinks, because the goal in life is not to like feel good at every single moment. He would think, there needs to be time when you're mourning the loss of a loved one or something like that. That's all part of a natural human life. And so he doesn't think pleasure is really your goal either, right? I mean, in the sense that you don't want to feel good at every moment. That's not the point in life. The point is to do these different human activities and do them well. And so the word virtue in ancient Greek, that just means excellence. And so that's his idea, is like, there's certain activities that we as human beings do those well, which means do them virtuously. And if you can if in your life you're able to do that, then your life was really a desirable and worthwhile life. So, I mean, that's the short answer. I mean, we can go into more detail on stuff there if you want.
Well, I'm curious about what he says about contemplation and how that sort of ties into living a worthwhile, virtuous life.
Yeah, so I guess that's kind of the final ingredient to this in a way. So the idea here is you're living this worthwhile life by doing these sort of activities that humans do and doing them well, right? So things like friendship and playing whatever social role you're in well, and having your emotional life regulated well, right? So you're doing that in your life, and then he thinks there's these other activities that we do, like understanding things, doing mathematics, doing science, and just understanding, like, what is reality like? And that's where contemplation starts to come in. So he thinks that activity is really something that's, when we've satisfied all our needs, what's left? That's what's left. And that's kind of the activity, the thing that we would do if we didn't have to, do practical things like feed ourselves and clothe ourselves and so on. We got free time, we'd want to do that. And those are the contemplative activities. And to give some, again, this sounds kind of weird, but to give some pretty concrete examples, I mean, I still think people more or less live this way. Like, what do you do when you're, done with taking care of the chores and done with your job and whatever? People go to movies, they listen to music, maybe they hang out with friends, or watch a play or read a book. And those are all like fundamentally contemplative activities. And so those are kind of the activities that Aristotle thinks are really what make life worthwhile most of all. And then there's another aspect to this is he wants you to be able to do this with your own life too. So look at your own life and be able to understand what's going on with it and say like, yeah, I did things well, right? So you can both contemplate like other things, like look at a sunset or watch a movie or read a book, right? And understand something that way. And then you can contemplate your own life and see like, well, I did what I was supposed to do in this situation, or I did the best I could, or whatever the case might be. And it's kind of that activity is the core of what he thinks happiness is, because that's what kind of all the other activities we're doing are for, on his view, is to allow us to be able to contemplate, right? To just see and understand what reality is, understand who we are, and so on.
If I think of that just from, I don't know if this is how he means it, but just from my own, personal experience, obviously this is anecdotal, but, like if I'm maybe having, like, if I'm looking at like a lazier period of my life where maybe I'm, not quite as sure about what my goals are, what I'm doing, and, maybe I'm not putting as much effort into those kind of like maintenance activities as far as, well, these are just the things that need to get done, and whatever, and like I just had different attitudes than I have now. I don't know if this is a function of how I was living my life or maturity, or if those two things are associated, but it seems like, if I'm more regulated and more on top of all the things I have to do and more pointed towards some kind of goal, then yeah, that sort of contemplative stuff just seems to come easier. Like I just seem to appreciate like even if it's something as simple as the weather, or, a walk in a park or in nature, that kind of stuff is just like, it's almost like, well, I've done what I needed to do. It's easier to kind of enjoy the things about life that are enjoyable. Whereas like if I were only focused on, the kind of the more pleasure-seeking aspects, eventually like that well goes dry pretty quickly, and it's really not as easy to, contemplate or enjoy. At least that's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think he would agree with that, because he thinks things like if we're just seeking pleasure or entertainment or to kind of distract ourselves, that's not contemplation. That's the opposite in a sense. And he even thinks those kind of like just vegging, in front of the TV or whatever, if that's kind of a modern day example, but I take it he would think, yeah, maybe you need to do that sometimes in life, like you're exhausted after a hard day of work, and that might be a way to relax for some people, and that's fine, but that's not contemplation, because contemplation is where you're not just vegging, right? You're actually appreciating what's there and appreciating for what it is. Yeah, and I think that's his idea. That's why he thinks the moral virtues, kind of where you're keeping your emotions and taking care of your practical business, those are all necessary for contemplation, because he thinks in order for contemplation to happen, you kind of have to be at a point where you're stable in life, right? Where your body is kind of more, I don't know, like not just like relaxed in the sense of like, oh, right now I feel relaxed, but just in the sense of where like, hey, I'm not starving right now, or I'm not, any number of things, not distracted, right? So that you can have that intellectual focus that's necessary for contemplation. And so, yeah, I take it he thinks like contemplation has got to be part of a rather ordered and I don't know what the word for it is, but yeah, it's like an ordered and excellent lived life, because that's what's going to give you that ability to engage in those higher intellectual pursuits, which is what's necessary for contemplation.
So this might sound a little bit academic, but do you think, so from what it seems to me, like by what you have described Aristotle's conception of happiness, do you think Aristotle thinks happiness as, to borrow a phrase from some other philosopher, thing in itself, or it is as a byproduct of things that we do? Find more meaningful in the moment and in the long run.
Yes, I think he thinks of it as a thing in itself.
Okay.
It is. I mean, he thinks that happiness really just is the activity of contemplation. So when we're contemplating, then we're happy. But since you can't just like contemplate all the time, like we were just talking about, you can't contemplate unless you've taken care of these other practical matters in your life and, are living in a certain way. I think, sure, everything we're doing is kind of for the sake of being able to do that activity of contemplation.
Okay.
And so, yeah, he thinks that's the thing that happiness really is. And, it's something that you can't have in isolation. So it's got to be part of this whole life. But it's that whole life that makes contemplation possible, and that also you can, then look back at yourself and go like, oh, I have this life that's a really desirable life. And yeah, that's what happiness is on his view.
Well, that sounds very practical for a philosopher, Aristotle. There is other branch of philosophy which is seen as more idealistic, which I sense some sort of difference between those school of thoughts. Maybe I'm wrong. The Stoic school of philosophy. So do you think the Stoics are different from what Aristotelian school of philosophy would think like? Or do you think they converge on some sense of what is happiness? Because as far as I'm aware, Stoics are like, leave the concept of happiness alone. That's just an attachment, and it would lead to more disenfranchised sense of belongingness towards things that you really don't want. So Stoics would say that the concept of happiness itself is going to cause you more unhappiness. We don't even know whether happiness exists as a thing. So do you think, do you sense like who is right and who is wrong in that manner? Do you have a sense of that and things like that?
Yeah, so I think Stoics have an idea of happiness that's pretty different from Aristotle's. I think you're right. They don't think of happiness as, like you're talking about, as like a thing itself.
Yes.
Right, they would think if you are thinking of it as a thing itself, that is a distraction. Yes. So they come up with their own kind of view of happiness, which is more like not being attached to things, right? So kind of whatever comes, I'm okay with that. Or, apatheia is the word they use, right? So it's just like not responding or kind of not letting things affect you. And so they would say, like, well, that's what happiness is, where you don't let things affect you, right? But yeah, that's, I think, the way you've been talking about this in terms of a, thing in itself or a byproduct, yeah, for them it's kind of a byproduct. It's sort of if we get our emotions in order, then I'm not going to be affected by things, then I'm going to be content, and that's what being happy is. So yeah, so I guess to kind of answer the first part of your question, they have a pretty different view from Aristotle in terms of what happiness is. They don't think it's this kind of like striving, fulfill human nature, do all these natural activities so much. I think it's more like detached from things, kind of stand back and realize everything is passing, things happen, they're not really in our control, and be okay with that. Where Aristotle sort of thinks, yeah, maybe happiness isn't completely in your control, that's fine, you at least need to strive for it still. Where they kind of think, no, like, it is in your control, all you need to do is, like, learn to recognize that all these external things aren't in your control. So, to the second part of your question, we can circle back on some of this if you want. But yeah, I tend to more agree with Aristotle's view on things. Primarily, I think, because his conception of human nature I find more convincing. So the Stoics, they think of human nature more as like just rationality is kind of the core of what we are. And it's kind of like, hey, I can take this detached rational perspective, and that's, when I do that, then I realize, hey, if I'm feeling a certain way, who cares? That doesn't matter. If a loved one dies, who cares? That doesn't matter. Things don't go like I wanted, that doesn't matter. Because that, my body isn't really me. I'm just this, detached rationality. Where Aristotle is a more holistic view where, no, as an individual human being, I am my body, actually. And so my body's desires and kind of the natural bodily responses to things like grief and desire and so on are all good. Those are all important, and if you want to live a good human life, it's a good life where those bodily like emotions and things like that are ordered in a certain way, instead of where they're just like left aside and said, well, that's not really me.
What I find fascinating about Stoicism is it was elaborated by two people in completely different circumstances in their life. Both wrote about their life stories and their philosophies. One was a king, another one was a slave. And both of them came to the same conclusions that life itself is more or less random, and if you try to cling to things that are temporary, you're going to lose happiness. So but I do also agree that it's very hard for people to achieve that detached perspective of rationality. As somebody who is also a little bit like comes from this tradition of like Buddhism and Hinduism, I see that strain of thinking even in the Hindu and the Buddhist philosophy, where they were like, you cannot be in control of things that happen to you. So the best way to do is to detach yourself from it and just be a watcher of events that happen to you instead of identifying yourself with those events. But as I said, it's very hard to do that. Most people don't do that even in India. Like it's very hard to do that even though they come from that philosophical school of thought.
It seems like with the Stoics, it's almost the idea or the aspiration is to be able to do this in a total vacuum, like where it's like, you mentioned like, oh, if my wife passes away, it's just my wife passing away. I'm going to look at it completely rationally and detached from that. And it seems completely incompatible with human nature and probably neurobiology and a bunch of other stuff too, where it's kind of like, well, that would be great. I mean, that would be a lot easier, but it's not really taking into account the fact that, while there may be individual differences in the way that people grieve or, how long it might take them to do that, like that's certainly something that's going to happen. And just to, take such an extreme example of like, okay, I'll just use the person that's closest to me in my life, and if they pass away tragically, I'm just going to be like, it's cool. It's just like if anyone else's wife died, like I'll be fine. It's like, I don't know. To me, it just seems like I want to say like, okay, good luck with that. Of course, in a sympathetic way, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like I do think it's like possible, because it seems like Buddhist monks achieve something like this, and so does Stoic sages, right? It's not easy. But I mean, I think the interesting question here is like, is it desirable or not, right? So even if it's like difficult, like, is that what we should be shooting for? And I think Aristotle would say like, no, that's not what you should be shooting for, because that's not human nature. But yeah, again, he thinks human nature more as like, grief is like a natural part of human life, and so why would I want to not feel that? So it almost does come down to this like conflict in what you think human beings are, right? If you think, well, human beings are this detached rationality, or human beings are kind of this, or in the Buddhist view, like, or certain versions of the Buddhist view at least, like there is no self, right? So there's no human being anyway, right? And things like that, then it's going to make a lot more sense to be like, why am I upset if my wife dies? But if you think, human being is like, we're animals, right? Like that's what we are. We're animals that have rationality, which is Aristotle's way of understanding it. And, so that's one of his definitions. His second definition is we're political animals, right? So we're animals that live in community. Then for him, this is just crazy that you wouldn't
participate,
grieve, because it's like not participating in the community if you're not grieving over your wife dying, right? That's the community you had with her, and then with the wider community as well. And so, he would think you're just not being human in that case, and that's not even desirable, right? So, so it is kind of like an interesting tension, like just radically different views, really, based on these different conceptions of what do you think a human being is.
Well, it's interesting because Stoicism seems to be pretty popular, and I don't know what the timeline of that is like, but at least I know that now, I mean, you can find plenty of Instagram profiles like dedicated to Stoicism, and they'll throw a Stoicism quote at you every day or whatever. And there's some people that have taken the idea of Stoicism and like repackaged it into something that you can use to basically, like kind of live your life by, and like Stoic readers where you kind of get, like a Marcus Aurelius quote every day, and then a Seneca one or whatever. But and there's like plenty of practical wisdom there that it seems like could be applied in any context. I mean, for example, Marcus Aurelius basically kind of like in your morning routine, like just deciding to recognize you're probably going to run into some knuckleheads today. So like just be prepared for it, and you'll probably have a better time of it, like, when that inevitably happens, and you won't be thrown off guard. Or
death is another thing that the Stoics thought that we should reflect upon, because then that is like the ultimate mirror, and everything that happens to you pales in comparison to what is going to happen to you in the end. I kind of think that Stoics also do recognize the fact that how hard it is to achieve the type of rationality or disattachment, if that's the right word, for normal peoples to do. And that is why within the Buddhist tradition and within the Stoic tradition, there is like the meditation exercises. Buddhist traditions have meditation exercises, and Stoic people have this reflection where they were like, just imagine that life is going to happen to you and there's nothing that you can do. And the more involved you get, the more you will run into brick walls, and eventually you will have to think about the fact that what is the ultimate use of me being involved so much in this. From when I take that perspective, I kind of have some sympathy towards Stoic people, but I also so the Buddhists have this idea that the world is illusion, and it keeps tempting you back into it. So the idea is to isolate yourself from the fact in order to achieve that sense of rationality or detachment, to see the things as they are for itself. But again, that requires discipline for you to go ahead and isolate yourself, and to either be focused and do a meditation, or be as detached as they want you to be. And maybe, and as Aristotle says, maybe that's not the point. That's not what you should be doing at all. And maybe highs and lows are both something that you should like. You should take into your stride, and that's the point of the life. So I'm sorry, I totally cut you off.
No, it's okay. I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, the conclusion I come to, or one of them, is that, well, Stoicism seems like it would be really practical. Maybe if you weren't terribly ambitious socially, and if it was like, which I'm not making a judgment about that, but then at the same time, though, like you mentioned, and like we've talked about, Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic, and here's somebody with like all the responsibility in the world. So, yeah, I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. Whereas, like, and I guess like to maybe lead that into another question. So if if I'm an Aristotelian, can I do that in virtually any circumstance? Do I have to have like a certain amount of is it just like a start wherever you're at kind of thing to sort of live virtuously and like live with some type of excellence, or depending on your circumstances, could that be a really tall order, and you might just not be able to do that given how your life is shaken out?
And just to add to that, do you think Aristotle would think you're living your life ethically if you just adopt a Stoic mindset? Imagine, I'm thinking Aristotle judging Marcus Aurelius. Aristotle would be like, you are the king, you're supposed to be engaged. And the moment you take this detached perspective, I think Aristotle would think that Marcus Aurelius is living an unethical life, because he's probably, to some extent, he's just running away from these responsibilities that he as a king has been given upon.
Yeah, I mean, I think Aristotle would say that about Marcus Aurelius, is to a certain extent. I mean, I don't know if he's like living an unethical life in the sense that he's doing wrong things, right? Because I mean, in a sense, like Aristotle and the Stoics agree on like, hey, you shouldn't murder people, you shouldn't whatever. But yeah, I think he would say, Marcus Aurelius, like, you're failing to be virtuous in certain ways, right? And instead, you're doing this, you're doing this other thing that is worse. So I think he would agree with that. To this question of, well, could anyone just take the Aristotelian approach, right? So the Stoic approach, I mean, I guess has come up a couple times in this conversation already. You're gonna have someone like Epictetus, who was a slave. He takes it, and Marcus Aurelius was the emperor. So it seems like anyone can kind of find some value in this Stoic approach, and I agree. There's a lot of value in it. But Aristotle's approach would be, I mean, if we stick strictly to what Aristotle, like himself at the time, would have said, right? I think he would have said, no, happiness is not even possible for like slaves and women, which is most of his society, right? Because he thinks of happiness as this like living this really flourishing human life, which is not possible for everyone, right? If you're born into a certain situation, or if you're oppressed in your society like women were at his time, that's just you're not going to be able to achieve those kind of virtues. At least at his time, you wouldn't be. So yeah, his happiness does have that feature where it's kind of like it's not there open for everyone. And I think that's historically one of the reasons why Stoicism became really popular in the Roman Empire, when it was kind of, you weren't kind of like standing out in your community anymore because you were in a bigger, in Aristotle's time, the small city-states, you kind of made a big difference in your community, and that's what like the virtuous person is like. Where as you get something like an empire, you don't stand out that much, and so now people are kind of, it's harder to kind of see yourself as like, am I really living as this outstanding person, or do I just need to learn, kind of go more in myself and find happiness inside in kind of a more Stoic way. But okay, so that being said, though, contemporary Aristotelians tend to want to like expand this though and say, no, like if we just, what we have an obligation to do is perhaps make it so that the political conditions are such that more people can engage in Aristotelian happiness. Right, so Aristotle was kind of like, yep, you're a slave, too bad for you. I guess you can't really pursue this, right? I mean, like that's kind of his attitude. And people who defend that, or to take a basic Aristotelian approach now, obviously don't say that. What they say is, well, what Aristotle already was kind of hinting at, which is, this is why politics is so important, because we need to make society such that the most people as possible can engage in this Aristotelian happiness. And I guess one other thing on this issue is that I take it like Plato, who's contemporary with Aristotle, his view is more like anyone can do it as well, because his view tends to be more like, just do the best you can in your situation, right? Yeah, you're not going to, doesn't mean you're going to hit the like highest ideal, because your situation might be pretty bad. But if you just do the best you can, then you do achieve a kind of happiness as an individual. And I take it that's, Socrates, who appears in Plato's dialogues. He says, hey, I'm willing to talk to slaves. He's willing to talk to women. He's willing to talk to all these people in his society, and kind of thinks, hey, they're actually better than the well-off people in general in terms of wisdom. He thinks at least they kind of recognize that, they don't know everything, or these other people think they do. And yes, I think the Platonic approach was more in line with, if everyone just kind of does the best that they possibly can in their circumstances, there's a kind of happiness there. So it was more inclusive, although it's also not Stoic either. It's more like Aristotle's in the sense that's based on human nature, having, kind of allowing our natural emotions to express themselves, but in a healthy way.
It almost seems like, given Aristotle's insistence upon finding the mean between excess and deficiency, that that could kind of, one could implement Stoicism within that framework of, okay, well, maybe right now is the time to exercise the virtue of detachment based on the situation that I'm in, but maybe my overall life is going to be more of one where I'm trying to attain happiness. And maybe that's one way, or those two of those could be compatible. I guess, which brings me to my next question. So was there a point somewhere historically, downstream from, ancient times, where these two philosophies may have been compatible or began to intermingle in the overall culture?
Yeah. So there was historically, which is kind of in late antiquity, right? So that'd be, I don't know, like 1st to 5th century AD, and then in the Middle Ages as well. you have both of these traditions sort of respected, and people are kind of like weaving them together, kind of trying to take what are the insights that Stoicism can give us, what are the insights that Aristotle can give us, what are the insights Plato can give us, and kind of working those together. And so, yeah, a lot of medieval philosophy is like that, and kind of like in Thomas Aquinas, for example, is kind of the major Western medieval philosopher. He'll quote Aristotle all the time, and he's basically an Aristotelian, but he'll also quote Seneca, who's a Stoic, and quote him positively as like, oh, here's a good point, that Seneca makes. And so yeah, these were kind of, beginning, early on, really, in the, I guess it would be 3rd century AD with Plotinus, who's a Neoplatonist. Plotinus takes a lot of Stoic ideals and kind of puts them together with Aristotle and so on. Yeah, because I think, and this is consistent with Aristotle's own methodology, because he says, I think it's in Book 2 of the Metaphysics, it's sort of the beginning of Book 2, that the truth is kind of like a barn door, like anyone can hit it. Like anyone hits it, right? We all get little parts of it. No one gets the whole thing. And so that's why we need to learn from even those that we disagree with. And right, that's the point Aristotle is making there. He's kind of, we need to learn from those who came before, those we disagree with, because they're getting part of the truth. And yeah, the way you're suggesting, you can kind of take the Stoic insight and then fit it into a overall Aristotelian framework. Or go the other direction, right? If you were a Stoic, you could say like, well, I think the Stoic framework's the best, but let me take these Aristotelian insights and maybe help modify the Stoic framework.
So I want to ask you something about your interest in 19th century philosophy too, because I know you are interested in that.
Yeah.
So before we begin with that, I would like to ask, what is your view about enlightenment? I know we are moving away from Aristotle to enlightenment as a big leap, but and we hopefully we should get to post-enlightenment also, which is what 19th century mostly is, because but what your view about this enlightenment as a philosophical school of thought, and how big of an impact it has had, and what philosophy is today?
Yes, it's had a major impact. My view on it is not super positive in a way, because kind of Enlightenment is the Dark Ages, I guess, from an Aristotelian perspective, because most of the thinkers, or kind of especially the early Enlightenment thinkers, were anti-Aristotelian. And I think I got a lot of things wrong there. At the same time, the real, high, German Enlightenment thinkers like Kant, I think he's like a first-class, thinker, and, and he's right up there with the greats like Plato and Aristotle. And so if he's like the representative of the Enlightenment, then there's a lot of good stuff there. So it depends whether you're, is Kant your Enlightenment person, or is like Voltaire, because I don't like Voltaire. I don't really like Descartes that much, but yeah, someone like Kant, who really kind of takes insights that Voltaire and Descartes and so on had, but then really works them out thoroughly into, full system. I think he's back to doing really good philosophy in the way that the Greeks did.
If I am right, Kant was the person that brought an end to enlightenment to some extent.
Yeah.
I don't mean it in terms of moral.
Yeah.
I mean it in terms of philosophical terms, because he was the first person to question whether we can actually know the thing called the big T, that is the truth. That was the whole Enlightenment project. It did not stop the Enlightenment project. It still carried on in terms of Bertrand Russell and stuff like that later. But he was the first person to actually start questioning whether what the Enlightenment people were talking about, rationality and science, and finding the big T out there, whether we can actually find it or not. So I think
so you wouldn't count him as Enlightenment?
I would count him as Enlightenment, but the last last Enlightenment philosopher, because if I trace the history properly, and I'm not a philosopher, I might be completely off on this. Once Kant stops working his Enlightenment, and he reaches the conclusions that he reaches completely using the Enlightenment ideas, and he works it up to its last point. you basically have people abandoning the Enlightenment ideas. You have the existentialists and the romantic movement. People who are like, we can't know the truth, so like, how do we ever get to know what the meaning of life is, and like, should we even try to chase the truth and things like that?
Yeah, and I mean, this is where I kind of said, like, it depends what we mean by Enlightenment, too, because I think, like, the French and the British Enlightenment were pretty different from the German Enlightenment, right? Where Kant is, I mean, Kant, like, himself claims to be, like, a representative of the Enlightenment, right? He has a whole little treatise or whatever it is on it's called, like, what is it called? Like, it's on Enlightenment or something like that. And so, so he takes himself to be an Enlightenment thinker, but you're right. He's pretty different than kind of the British Enlightenment thinkers, or like Voltaire or someone like that. Yeah, because he kind of doesn't think you can just kind of, hey, we're going to just figure out like the ultimate truth now, right? And so he ends up being more influential on Romanticism and on these like anti-Enlightenment kinds of philosophies. Even though he himself would think like, I'm the real representative of the Enlightenment, and that is kind of where you get this interesting thing. And so that's what I mean. Like, if we talk about the Enlightenment as like the French and British Enlightenment, I think that seems like a new Dark Ages to me, because like it's anti-Aristotelian. It's like, they think they figured out everything, where their like systems don't make any sense. Where if Enlightenment we mean like Kant, which has, even though it's not the same at all as like Aristotle or Platonism, it still has like that really sort of like thoroughly worked out rational framework, and kind of and more careful too, and in the sense of saying, what can we know, what can't we know, and let's be really careful about that. Again, I kind of think Kant is good, like that's the good kind of Enlightenment. But the other one, the earlier Enlightenment, I don't really see a whole lot positive in it, except that it was necessary, to kind of deal with the breakdown of the, church at the time, and kind of like, well, where do we turn if we don't have this moral authority? We're going to have to turn to reason. And I mean, that is kind of where you have to turn. So I kind of read the history of more like, and all those people were building to Kant, who actually like worked this out. Of Kant, and then Hegel, after Kant, just kind of immediately after, who kind of work out that tradition, fix all its problems, or most of its problems. And those are the real like Enlightenment thinkers. But that is kind of a debate, within philosophy, even what counts as like the actual Enlightenment.
I was wondering if you could actually break that down a little bit more for maybe, like honestly for me, but also for other people listening who might not be as familiar with a Voltaire, and maybe if you could, juxtapose those two, like Aristotle and Voltaire, and maybe why they're so different.
So I guess one of the things is that someone like Voltaire is very like anti-traditional, right? So him and Descartes is kind of this way on like a philosophical level. So Voltaire is perhaps more on like an ethical and social level. But like kind of this idea of, and again, this is a caricature in a sense, right? Like I'm just oversimplifying a little bit, but there's this kind of like rejection of what came before, right? And so,
would you say even almost just like for the sake of it, or
or it's just not even understanding it, right? It's just like, throw that out because it must have been bad, and let's do something new, right? Instead of let's try to understand that and let's try to learn from it, it's more like, nope, that was wrong, let's do this new thing now. And so I guess I'll parallel kind of what I take, again, these are oversimplifications, but Descartes and then Voltaire too. So Descartes kind of did this on a like more theoretical level, where he was like, let's get rid of this like Aristotelian way of understanding reality. That doesn't work anymore. I've got my whole new way, and my way, I'm starting over from scratch. And he says that. He's like, I'm going to, tear down everything that came before and just start over. So I think that attitude right, so Aristotle's the opposite, right? Aristotle is saying we need to learn from our predecessors because even if they made some mistakes, they still got to the truth in a lot of ways, and so we should be building on them. And so that's where you get like the opposite. Voltaire kind of does this more, I mean, famously with sort of attitude towards religion, right? Like throw out, what has been like the religious and social tradition of Europeans for centuries, and let's just start over from scratch, again, based on just rationality. Right, and again, that's also anti-Aristotelian. Aristotle would be like, wait, we don't just throw stuff out. We criticize it maybe in certain ways, but we also need to see what was good in it, what was helpful in it. And so I think that's kind of the major difference I see is these early Enlightenment people just want to throw everything out the window. And because they did that, they make like a lot of mistakes, right? They start over and like what happens is like really interesting, but they get a lot of things wrong. They come up with problems that's like insolvable on their own system. And so it's not until you get to Kant who you have someone who's a little more balanced in his attitude, where again, he'll have this kind of Enlightenment attitude like, well, I'm doing my own new thing now. But he's learning from his predecessors, and then he also is just more careful where, he wants to make sure, where did people come before him get things right? Where did they overstep? And he's very critical of people, traditions that came before him, but at the same time doesn't just want to throw them out the window, right? And so I think, a good comparison is Kant's attitude towards religion compared to Voltaire. So Voltaire is just like, throw it out, like this is all nonsense. Where Kant is more nuanced. He's not super like, hey, I'm just going to defend Christianity here. But he also is not like very harsh on it either, right? He thinks it can offer a lot of good, especially when interpreted in the right way. He wants to give kind of a rationalistic interpretation of Christianity, but again, for him it's not let's throw this out the window. It's more like let's see what was here, let's see what was true in it, and let's kind of go from there. Where Voltaire is going to be like, nope, all that was nonsense. And so that's why, again, this early Enlightenment is, in my mind, is kind of a misnomer, because it's like, let's throw ourselves back into the Dark Ages where we don't, we're not going to like learn from people who came before us. We're just going to like throw them out without any good reason to do that. Or for just like political reasons, like, well, I don't like the church and therefore I'm going to have to like throw out everything associated with it. I just don't think that's like a helpful like way to approach things in general, right? Even if you don't like something, that doesn't mean there's not a lot of good and truth in that, and learning to see that as the important thing instead of just like throwing it out and starting over.
Go
ahead.
Okay. As far as I know, Kant's most work is a response to David Hume.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because David Hume was like one of the greatest Enlightenment thinkers, and I personally like Hume. I have like bit of sympathy towards Enlightenment because we have today's scientific method established during Enlightenment era. For example, Bacon, John Stuart Mill, they've worked out how to really understand causality and things like that. And like I know there is a Popperian version of it that comes later, but that's more or less an accumulation of what has happened before. But I think we also need to stress this fact that anti-enlightenment doesn't mean anti-reason, because like the philosophers who come later do put reason as the thing that is important. So they don't argue illogically. They just say that some of the tenets of enlightenment don't work upon itself. So I do like from my personal perspective, as I read the history of philosophy, I see like the Kant working very much within the Enlightenment tradition, but the person who after whom the Enlightenment doesn't like go further. You have like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and Hegel is another person, but like then philosophy kind of takes political turn too, with Marx adopting Hegel and stuff like that. So from that perspective, I was thinking Kant as like the last person to use Enlightenment. now since we are in the 19th century European philosophy, I want to ask you a question.
Stop you really quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to put a pin historically in where you're at, but there's one more like Aristotle question I want to ask, and I'm kind of curious. So, Aristotle being as influential on, a Saint Thomas Aquinas and Christian thought in the Middle Ages, yet not having the same view of God that they would adopt entirely. I'm curious if we could just wildly speculate what an Aristotle might have thought based on his framework about how his view of reality and his view of God, how that influenced culture down the line from him, and sort of what he might make of that.
So you're asking, like, hey, if Aristotle could kind of look at things now and be like, what would he think, or is the question more like, hey, what if Aristotle lived like 300 years later? Would he have become Christian, or
yeah, if like, well, okay, so like, I guess maybe coming from Aristotle has this view of God, and it's not anthropomorphic, and it's sort of like the first cause. Forces of nature kind of thing, reason why things happen, but not necessarily a loving God that you would pray to, that listens to your prayers and things like that. Yet he was so heavily influential on Christian thought, which obviously has those components to it, and I'm curious what he might make of that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you could, it's hard to tell what he would make of it, right, because it's before, but I think he would go in kind of one of the two directions that medieval Aristotelians went. So you have people like Thomas Aquinas in Europe who go in the direction of like, hey, I'm Aristotle, but then I also have faith, in the Revelation, in the Bible and in the church and so on, and so that faith tells me things that are true that you can't know through reason, but that don't contradict reason either, right? And so he would think, we can't know through reason that God like answers prayers or interacts in history or things like that. But he thinks I can know that through faith, and yes, you can't prove that faith is true using reason, right? So Aquinas makes that distinction, right? So you could have Aristotle who would just become Aquinas, right? To be like, I have my Aristotelian views, and then, hey, this, Christianity is actually like convincing, and I actually take that on faith, not on reason, but on faith. Or, right, so that's the one direction he could have gone. Or the other direction is kind of how some of the major Islamic philosophers went. And I'm thinking specifically probably of Al-Farabi, because he's most clearly in this direction, and Jewish philosophers, like I think Maimonides goes this way too, is to sort of say, well, look, Aristotle's philosophy is right. We can figure all this out by reason, but we still need religion as like it has a social function for average people, right? Everyone's not going to be a philosopher. And so they need to have a way to relate to the absolute, right? To relate to reality that's kind of in more anthropomorphic terms. So they need to think about God as like, I pray to it, and it's kind of like this person-like thing. And so Aristotle himself probably has that view, it seems, at his time, right? So, there's like Zeus and Hera and Athena, right? And I take it Aristotle's view, I mean, this is kind of speculative, but this seems to be the basic scholarly consensus these days on Aristotle's own relationship to Greek religion would have been something like, all that's like strictly speaking false, right? Like, there's Zeus not doing any of this stuff that we say he does in the myths, and when we're celebrating these festivals, like, that's not actually true. What's true is what we know philosophically or scientifically, but those are still like really important. It's important that people have those myths, and it helps our community kind of come together. And so people like Al-Farabi in the Middle Ages in the Islamic world thought, hey, that's kind of how it is maybe with Islam as well, right? It's kind of this, it talks about God in more in like a, anthropomorphic way sometimes, but that's helpful for people who aren't doing philosophy. But if you're doing philosophy, you kind of realize, well, those anthropomorphic things are false, And maybe there's other, there's not like one true religion either. There's different cultures have their own religions. But we do need religion, for its social function. So I think, if you go back to kind of the original question, then I think, what would Aristotle do kind of in light of this later thing? He'd either become, someone like Al-Farabi, who would be like, well, I'm doing my philosophy and religion is, a way of popularizing that, getting people to kind of live well and to help educate people in the community. Or he'd be like a Thomas Aquinas, is like, hey, I'm doing this, and then, well, I, have faith in Christ, actually, and now I accept all these truths on the basis of faith, and I think they're literally true. But they don't contradict reason, and we go and we do philosophy and theology. But you're actually, in that case, he would accept things that you can't prove rationally. Or in the former case, in the Al-Farabi case, you don't really accept those things that you can't prove rationally. You just say, those are, metaphorical ways of talking, so other people, it's kind of, if I explain to you, you should be virtuous because if you don't, you're going to be unhappy. You might be like, what are you talking about? I'm going to be unhappy if I don't live a virtuous life. It looks like if I get like money, power, like sex, like that's great. Where if you tell people like, hey, no, you're going to go to hell if you do those things, a lot of people would not do those things if you tell them they're going to go to hell, right? Where if you just say, well, you're not going to reach true happiness in life, they won't care, right? And so that's why I take it, even people like Plato and Aristotle at their time seem to not be against telling, these kind of like myths about torture and the afterlife or heaven or something, their own versions of that kind of thing. Even if they didn't think that was literally true. Yeah.
I think it's easy now to look on that stuff and just think like, well, look at how nefarious organized religion is, and it's like they're using fear to control people, and like clearly you're not going to burn in hell for eternity if you steal a piece of like a candy bar from a store if you're a kid or something like that. Like, who would say that to somebody? That's nuts. But at least like from a different perspective, it's kind of like, well, they weren't really trying to do that necessarily. They're kind of taking into account the fact that even if people have the intellectual capacity to do philosophy, most people probably just don't even want to. It doesn't even sound fun to them. So what's some other way? And then it seems a lot less, at least from that perspective, like this sort of like nefarious, like we have to, control the populace and because, like we're evil. And I'm sure the Illuminati has something to do with it and the lizard people or whatever. But
yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of the interesting thing, right? Because the early Enlightenment sort of cast this as nefarious, right? It's like you're trying to control us and so on. But I think what Aristotle would look at this, and what people like Al-Farabi looked at it as, is no, like we're trying to tell you the truth in a way you can understand it, right? And if you can't understand like what's literally true, right, that you're going to be unhappy, and that's like the worst thing that can possibly happen to anyone. If you're not going to like understand that, if I tell you that, you're going to not find that convincing to changing your behavior. I'll tell you in a way you can understand, which is you're going to suffer pain forever. But it's not even especially in someone like Al-Farabi's view, and I mean the same goes with a lot of Christian teachings as well that people like Aquinas would think are metaphorical. It's not to control you. If you want to understand the philosophy, you're welcome to it. They see it as, a stepping stone. Is first you're going to understand it and kind of like, I'm afraid of this because I'm going to go to hell. And then, if you want a deeper understanding, maybe you realize, well, wait, no, I'm not afraid because I'm going to go to hell. I'm afraid because this is just not good. And that's like not what I want at all. And so, again, I don't think... I guess, another way it's not nefarious is they're not trying to hide anything. It's just more like, we're not going to tell you kind of the literal truth until you're ready to hear that. Or if we do tell you the literal truth, we'll also tell you this, more metaphorical thing because that's the thing you're ready to hear.
Well, thanks for asking that question.
Sure. So let's Hegel and Nietzsche and pick up where we left off.
And that's a perfect segue to the type of question I was thinking about, because as you mentioned, during the medieval times we had Thomas Aquinas and people who thought religion was important. But then come the Enlightenment people who are like, religion is a form of social control, a bunch of myths given to you by the church, and we demand reason as the most important thing. And that leads to like a very widespread skepticism among the general population in Europe, and the religion as its, and one thing, credit where credit is due, that leads to like separation of church and state, which is for me personally very important. But then you have bunch of philosophers later who grapple with this question of what are the consequences of not having religion. People like Kant was one person. He did write a lot about religion. But then you have Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. These are the two existentialists who are like everybody talks about. Nietzsche famously announced death of God. Everybody knows maybe you could elaborate what actually death of God means. It's supposed to be a tragedy. Kierkegaard said that religious faith helps him to deal with existential angst. Kant famously put on the moral principle about do unto others what you expect others to do to you, and he said Christianity had something to do with it. So these are the people who said that religion, they grappled with the consequence of the society becoming irreligious. And what are your thoughts about that? How much do you think there is something to be said about that fact, about once the society becomes more and more irreligious, the moral foundations of it becomes very harder to replace and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I think, to step back a little, because I think what's kind of underlying this shift that happens in the 19th century, and I guess begins earlier, is that there's, within Christianity, and especially within Protestant Christianity, there's this tension between almost two totally different ways of understanding religion. So the one is this social understanding of religion, which is kind of what we were just talking about, right? Where religion has this really important social function that even if we're only telling myths that aren't actually true, so what? This is really important socially because it kind of gets everyone kind of accepting the same moral code, kind of living according to the same customs, having the same basic values, right? And so, again, that's how people like Aristotle or Al-Farabi, even Aquinas to some degree, are going to say, religion is playing that really important role, so we don't want to get rid of it, even though we think it's false, right? So there's that social kind of religion. And then, but kind of what starts to develop, I guess, is in late medieval Christianity especially, and then finally really flourishes in Protestantism, is this personal kind of religion. This understanding of religion is my personal relationship to God or to the absolute, right? So I'm coming with my own personal beliefs, my own personal interpretation of the Bible. And then eventually, goes into where you might not even be Christian anymore, but you still have your own personal religion, your own personal way of thinking about things, right? So now, in that case, religion is not social. It's just kind of your own personal beliefs about things, or about kind of what ultimate reality is. Okay, so that tension is there, in Protestant Christianity. So what starts to happen, I think, in the Enlightenment is people are like, well, let's get rid of the social kind of religion because it's looks like social control. They don't like it for various reasons. A lot of them is just I don't particularly like the church's way of doing that, and so let's just get rid of all of it, right? Yeah. And so that starts to happen, and eventually, so that starts to happen in the earlier Enlightenment thinkers in Hume and so on, but eventually, in the 19th century, that becomes more trickles down into society at large, and that's what I think Nietzsche means by the death of God. Is it's no one respects this anymore, right? So they might even say they believe in it, they might go to church, all of that, but it doesn't have any real. They fear, it doesn't invoke any fear in their life, right? They're not really afraid of it. And they don't really respect it in that sense. And that's why it's a tragedy in a way, because he's sort of saying this whole social religion with its morality that goes along with it, with kind of our shared values, our shared community, is gone, and like we killed it, and now there's nothing to do. Like it's gone, and you can't. So it's not even a claim about whether God exists or not. It's just a claim of like it's no longer operative socially, right? It no longer is having that social influence, and God no longer is having that social influence. Right, and so Nietzsche kind of thinks like, okay, it's gone, good riddance, because like, life needs to move on anyway, right?
Yes.
So he kind of has this idea of, these things happen and life, is going to continue to go, and
become the Superman.
Yeah, so now it's time to come up, which is in a sense his own. It's kind of like we need to make our own religion now.
Yes.
And if you're one of the great people, at least, like if you're the Superman, you're gonna your own personal religion, right? Again,
With
like
its-
not the social one.
With its own set of morality.
Yeah, with its own set of morality, and now either that's going to become the dominant one, or maybe each individual will become a Superman, and we each come up with our own morality, right? And he doesn't really have a fully worked out idea of what's supposed to happen, but yeah, that's kind of his idea. Is like now the social thing is done, you come up with your own morality and your own. So he kind of takes that idea of this personal religion to the extreme, gets God out of it too, because he's like, I'm just making this up, right? It's not like I'm receiving some revelation from God that's, my personal interpretation of the Bible is God telling me how to interpret it. He's like, no, I'm making this up, and no one should get in the way of that, right? And so God needs to get out of this picture, because God's like someone else, there in my way.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I take it that's like Nietzsche's sort of like response here, right? The other thing is, I guess you mentioned with like Kant and Kierkegaard, and I think they give you the other two responses to this idea of having a personal religion, right? So Nietzsche's again is kind of like, so if you have a personal religion, go for it, right? That means you're making up your own personal morality, your own everything. Where Kierkegaard, his view seems to be more like, no, what I need to do, and, yes, it's going to be a personal religion, but it's one where I'm going to receive something from God, right? So I get some kind of like faith, which is something I can't make happen for myself. And then I accept that. I mean, maybe it doesn't happen to me too, right? So in Fear and Trembling, for instance, the sort of synonymous author that's like writing it is saying like, I don't have faith. And like, I respect faith. I wish I had it, but I don't. And he's talking about Abraham's faith and, saying like, that's great. And it's, that's like the most amazing thing and the hardest thing to do. And I can't do it. Right. So it's not saying, on that view, it's kind of like, this is not in my power, but, if that moment comes and I can accept it, that's the most authentic thing to do. Right. And so again, it's kind of the same idea of like a personal relationship to the absolute. But now, instead of in Nietzsche, where it's like, I just assert, it's
My
me
will to
doing what I
power.
want. This is more like, no, I need to be open to something happening that I could never predict and never expect. And when it happens, I've got to accept it. And that's going to be really difficult, but I need to do that. So those are kind of two responses. Kant, I think, is like a third one, where... So both Nietzsche and Kierkegaard share this idea of being anti-rational. Like they sort of, Nietzsche's just pretty explicit about it. Like, yep, reason doesn't give you truth. That's just like your own will to power. If you want to believe in reason, that's fine. That's your own religion. But like rationality doesn't doing what everyone thinks it's doing, right? It's not giving you the absolute truth. And Kierkegaard kind of thinks the same thing as well, right? He would be less radical in the sense that I take it Kierkegaard would think mathematics, gives you some truth. But yeah, you would think it doesn't give you the absolute, though. You
Yes.
don't really get the full picture of reality through rationality. Whereas Kant is more like, you do, like, sure, reason doesn't give you the ultimate truth, but it does give you, like, everything you need to know in order to live. And so Kant thinks, hey, we can do science, we can use reason to figure out the world as far as we could ever understand it by using science, and we can do ethics and, figure out how to live. And so on Kant's view, it's kind of like reason can figure out everything we need, at least, even if it doesn't give us everything. And so, Kant kind of goes back again to this more like, so my personal religion, again, can be sort of, I might have my own personal way of expressing that or thinking about it or relating to it, and that's fine. now I can do that, although, and we can still function socially because we can all agree on the rational stuff. And I think he's still going to have a place for the social side of religion too. Although, again, different people interpret Kant in different ways here. But yeah, I take it he would think, hey, religion might help people live morally, so great.
Yes.
Go ahead and be, he's just not going to think faith is giving you this extra thing that you could, never figure out or something like that. He's going to be more like, reason can get us everything we need, but still, religion might be a helpful thing either socially or if you personally like thinking about things a certain way, great. And so Kant is kind of the pro-rational side there. So yeah, again, you get to these three views where Nietzsche is just your own personal faith. It's not reason. It's your own personal will. And, it's not faith anymore. You got to make your own religion. Kierkegaard is more it's not reason. It's, this faith that's coming from something totally outside of you might take hold of you sometime and be willing, let that happen if it happens. And then Kant's more all that, reason, all that's kind of nonsense, basically. I think on Kant's view is, would be more reason can figure out what we should do, what's right and wrong, and, what we can know about the world through science. That's it. That's all we really need. And so, but still, you might want to go to church because if that's helpful for you to, have community, to find like-minded people. And you might want to have your own personal beliefs if that's helpful for you. So he's not anti-religious, as a result, but he's not really pro-religious in the sense that Kierkegaard is. So I think that those are kind of the three different views you could have to this kind of modern sense of religion, where religion is this kind of personal thing and not so much like a social thing.
Yeah, that's interesting because there are people who struggle with these sort of things, and I mean, one of the things that we do study is religious struggles, and a lot of people who kind of have the struggles with. Some people explicitly go against religion, and some people want to revive some aspects of religion. I would say Kant kind of restores both of it. He does recognize the absurdity that is there, and but also restores some of the functions that could be psychologically helpful for certain people to have that sort of religious faith, which could work for some people. So that's interesting. So we talked about religion, we talked about reason, we talked about how to achieve happiness and stuff like that. So there are many smart people out there who look at philosophy in general as a field and think it's just ideas in the air, and it's not very helpful for in practical terms and stuff like that.
It's just people talking in circles, just saying the same thing over and over again. And
it's they're too much time in their hands and stuff like that. So what, as somebody who actually does this for a living, what would be your response to them? How would you explain it to them that these ideas have a trickle down effect into broader culture? Because they don't come from they don't come out organically. It's somebody has worked out these reasons and stuff like that in the academia, and from that source you have this trickle down effect, which then affects the broader culture as such. So but that's my view. I'm interested in knowing your view to somebody who asked that question.
Yeah, so I guess, just someone who says philosophy is talking about things all up in the air, right? And I think, but we're all living our life according to things that are all up in the air. It's just we don't recognize that they're all up in the air, right? Because we all live our life on the basis of a bunch of assumptions about hey, it's obvious one is it's wrong to kill people, and that's a pretty easy to figure out why it's wrong to kill people assumption. But you live your life on other assumptions too that are a little more sophisticated, humans have rights. Well, you're living your everyday life as if that was true, right? If someone wrongs you, you call them out on it, or if or whatever it takes, or so you're living your life. Or what you think of a human being is. What is happiness? You have some kind of conception of it in your everyday life, and maybe you have a few different ones, right? So we're all kind of always dealing with and using these ideas that are all up in the air. The only reason why they don't seem up in the air in everyday life is because you're just not asking anything about them, right? You're just assuming, oh, no, that's obviously true. Where if you start to ask about it, you realize, no, it's not obviously true. And that's why it's in the air, right? Because it just seems like groundless. Yeah, and so that's what I kind of, yeah, to people who kind of like pose it in that way, like, right, like this is all about ideas up in the air, I say, yeah, you're living your life on the basis of ideas that are up in the air. What philosophy is trying to do is figure out, of these ideas that we're living according to, which ones are better, which ones actually make more rational sense, which ones are like coherent with other ones, right? Which ones are consistent. And then which ones, ultimately, are more true, and how do we figure that out? And so yeah, I think that's the value. And then, like you said, because, certain people do this kind of on a really high academic level, they kind of change culture over time and change the way that people take for granted. And it does trickle down, right?
Yes.
And so, what we take for granted as modern people is radically different from what medieval people took for granted, right? That's why, for us, whether you have, faith in a certain religion or not, that's like a real question for pretty much anyone to one degree or another, right? It's, even if you're deeply religious or you're not, that's going to be kind of like, hey, that's a question out there. Where I take it for your average medieval, person, that wouldn't have been a question. You'd have been like, I grew up in England, I'm Catholic, it's the 12th century, right? Like, what? Yeah, of course. That wouldn't have been like a burning question on people's mind. Why? Because these philosophical ideas have just changed the way we conceptualize ourselves and what we think is self-evident.
Yeah, I would also like to add, like this, not so long ago, around 1950s, when the UN started to think about this conception of human rights, it was being challenged a lot by academia with this regards to what can we actually have human rights, and humans do have rights or not. Another thing would be the animal rights. We do take for granted that animals have rights and we should treat them ethically to some extent. But that's not something that has been historically taken for granted. It was usually seen that animals did not have any feelings or emotions and things like that, and it was up to us to make use of them as we seem to as we seem fit. So, like the capacity of these ideas to change the culture is very large, and it has happened historically. So that's what I personally think, that's the value in studying philosophy, because it changes the culture one inherits at any given point of time.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess I would add to that too, if people want a more, because I totally agree with that. And then I guess on a more personal level, and I mean, this wouldn't apply for everyone, but I think for certain kinds of people, philosophy is kind of the way you naturally think of things in your life. Like some people are just kind of like thinkers, and they ask these kind of questions whether they're studying philosophy or not. I mean, that's how it was for me. One of the reasons I decided to major in philosophy as an undergraduate, because I just took the class, like I didn't know what philosophy was, and it was just kind of a elective or required class, for gen ed. And so I took it, and I was like, whoa, these people are they're kind of thinking how I was always thinking and kind of asking the same kind of questions. I never knew like anyone else did this, because most people aren't talking about this in everyday life. But so that's something that really, for me, it deeply affects my own way I live my life every day, in my own personal way of dealing with life and with the world. And I think that's not just for me, that's for a lot of people who are they approach the world in that more, kind of like critical way, and asking questions like this. Philosophy can have a real personal impact if they study it. And something you'd really miss out on if you didn't study it, for certain people, again, because, I can't imagine what it'd be like if I didn't, I'd be like a totally different person if I hadn't done philosophy. I mean, not just because, I do it professionally, but just because how I view things is so influenced by it. And I don't think I would be as happy. And again, I'm not saying that's for everybody, but I am saying for certain types of people, I think for them to major in philosophy, it's like practical in the sense like you'll be a happier person if you're kind of, able to take that natural way that you relate to the world and then start like learning how to do that well, right?
Sure.
So if you're naturally kind of, hey, I like to think about things rationally, well, philosophy can teach you, here's how you actually do that well, and we'll give you some rules for logic and things like that. So you think there's that kind of personal side, there's the grand scheme of things side, and the social, the way this is going to affect culture, and then there's the more personal side of some people. This is really going to help you personally, depending on who you are. And, other people know you'll hate it, but, right? But yeah, I do think it's true that, we all kind of deal with these questions. We deal with them in different ways. And for those people who deal with them in this intellectual kind of way, it can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that, that, like you said, it kind of depends on who you are, but, that could be a tough sell, I think, nowadays, and that college it's so expensive, but there's still a lot of incentive to go. In that everyone kind of knows, like, well, if you get a college degree, here's what your job prospects are, here's where your earning prospects are, here's what happens if you don't. So if you're one of these people that is going to go to college and take on that expense, then the question becomes, well, okay, what's the best shot to sort of get a return on this investment? Okay, well, STEM's really big right now. And, I kind of fell into this myself. I'm a non-traditional student, and I remember, before I decided to come to school, Googling, like, most, like, marketable degrees or something like that. And then, always thinking that something like philosophy, I didn't totally understand it. That sounds pretty interesting, though. Like, I'm a musician. Maybe I'll get a degree in music. But, like, always kind of coming to this, like, not very well-informed conclusion that, oh, but those are just degrees. And also, I think from things I've heard other people say is like, oh, well, that degree is just going to be collecting dust, and I'm going to have a lot of debt, and what am I going to do with that? Like I was saying, Googling, most marketable degrees and seeing something like liberal arts or philosophy just like at the absolute bottom of the list, and then, computer science like right near the top, and I'm kind of like, well, I'm not a computer science guy at all, like, but, maybe I could become one, I don't know. And then initially going in kind of like a STEM route, and then I had a brief detour into accounting, and then it was kind of like, wait a minute, what am I thinking? Like, that's not, I mean, God bless the accountants out there, but like, it's just not me, even to the point where, I was kind of at this point where, I was making a lot of changes, and it was kind of like, hey, I've made a lot of changes. Who knows? Maybe I could do something like this now. And then coming out of that and then saying, oh yeah, I'm gonna major in psychology to, people that I knew, and they're like, yeah, I kind of wondered what you were thinking with that accounting thing, but like, I say all that because I really wish I would have gotten into philosophy earlier, and I came to it pretty late in my undergrad career, and I wish I could have gotten more classes in, but just going in a route that was eventually more fulfilling to me has been worth it for me. But for a lot of people that might be like I am, where they're just like, well, I got to get a job, I'm just going to go engineering because that seems like, oh, you'll make $80K at some point, and that sounds good, and I guess I'll do that. So when people are contending with that, it's kind of like, well, why go into philosophy? And I think we've kind of already been talking about that, but
yeah, I mean, I think first of all, philosophy and liberal arts degrees in general get kind of like, they have this bad reputation, which in a lot of ways is unwarranted even, right? So there's certain kind of degrees, like engineering, which is like pretty clear. I get a degree in engineering, I get a job as an engineer, right? We can get the same name, you know how much you're going to make even, ballpark at least, right? So there's this real kind of like clear linear process of like this degree, this job. But a lot of majors aren't like that. Even a lot of STEM ones, like biology, isn't really like that, where it's, there's a number of avenues you can go, and psychology too, right? If psychology counts as STEM, which I'm not sure if it does, but
It does.
It does? Okay, yeah. But I mean, either way, right? Like an undergraduate.
For the NIH-funded program that I was in that placed me in a lab as a research assistant as an undergrad, it's a science.
Okay. Well, yeah, so...
We do use the Popperian scientific method, so...
Yeah. Okay, then there you go. So, but I mean, I guess that's a good example, too, is like, with an undergraduate in psychology, there's no, like, hey, this is the job you get, right?
Yeah.
There's any number of jobs you could get. And I think that's the same thing for philosophy and most liberal arts degrees as well. There's not kind of like this, I did engineering and now I'm an engineer. Or, I did, an undergrad in psychology. It doesn't mean you're going to be a psychologist, right? You would have to go to graduate school. And so, so I think, there's first of all this misperception there where people are kind of not recognizing that, wait a minute, there's a bunch of these degrees that don't have like this clear linear path. But that doesn't mean they don't have a path, right? And if I've talked to people at the Career Center here, who try to place our CSU students in jobs. And their kind of attitude is, look, especially in today's job market, these non-linear approaches, right? These approaches where you do what you like and then we'll find something that you can do with that, because there's a lot of different options out there. And I mean, there is a study that says that philosophy majors 5 years out are making more money than business majors, right? And I don't know why that is. It might be because they go on to graduate school and become lawyers or whatever, right? And so I think there just is this misperception that this will just be a dead end if you have this liberal arts degree. Where no, it's just like you're going to have to be a little more creative, right? It's not going to be like I do philosophy and then I become, undergraduate philosophy and now I'm a philosopher and I make money doing that. But again, a lot of STEM, biology is like that too. There's not, like a linear, undergrad straight into a job, that only would take biology majors kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a lot of it. And then, I guess the second part of this would be you can do both, right? So you were saying how you found, taking this personal fulfillment route was actually really helpful for you, and that's same with me as well. And I think if people are, if you just kind of, I realized, like, I certainly wasn't thinking this way when I was going to college as an undergraduate, but if you think through it, you could get your degree in engineering if you want, take an extra year and double major in something, right? Like in psychology or philosophy or something that's going to help you kind of better understand who you are. Sure, you might have to take an extra year with a program like engineering because it requires so much of their students. But so what? You're going to be making enough money to like pay the student loans off. So wouldn't it be nice to have some, like, figure out who you are and, achieve something that you can, is much more difficult to achieve later in life when you're kind of on a normal 9-to-5 job and you've got a family. To ask these kind of bigger questions is not as easy to do at that point. And so while you're young and have that opportunity, why not take the extra year and, do a humanities major or do a, or some major that's going to help you, like, achieve some personal fulfillment in addition to your money-making major. So I think, both those, once we kind of recognize, hey, philosophy is actually not that bad in terms of getting you a job. It can get you a job. It's just not this, like, obvious, linear, I got this degree and now here's this field that only wants philosophy majors. And then combine that with the idea that, and I should also do something in my college career that helps me better understand who I am in the world. And, both those, you should either be like double majoring in philosophy or whatever, is going to work for you. Just major in philosophy and, figure out what, find a career that can use that and they're out there. I guess that's kind of like a lot, but
yeah, I kind of wish there was more of an emphasis put on that, in the culture, and that it weren't something that just kind of got dismissed. I think that even there's so many adults out there, I think, that would just say to a young person that they didn't even really know that well, that they heard what they were going into, that would be like, oh no, you got to go into this, like there's no money in that, what are you doing? And it's like, without even thinking twice, there's just this knee-jerk, like, why are you doing that? You got to go into STEM, like, or like whatever it is, or just something where it just, I don't know, I just think like that anything that involves personal development just gets like a short shrift, I think.
And I think that's a cultural prejudice that we have in the U.S., where it's kind of like, it's almost just like, I only think in terms of money, right? It's kind of like, I'm going to spend money on this and I need to be like making money as a result of that. But I think if we shift the focus a little and say, well, wait a minute, if I could pay again for maybe another year of tuition, I know that's a lot of money, but and get a degree that really helps me better understand myself and the world, and is going to make me a better and more well-rounded and happier person, say, yeah, why wouldn't you spend a few $1,000s on that? I mean, what are you going to be doing with all this money you're making, Here's a chance to like spend it on something that's going to allow you to become a happier person. And yeah, and I do think that's, I know that's not kind of the typical attitude people have towards college, but I don't see why not, right? People spend all kinds of money on trying to make themselves happy in various ways, and I think this is one that actually works pretty well. And so, again, get that practical degree if you're in a situation where you need to do that, but why not double major, or at least get a minor in in something that's a little more meaningful.
Do you have anything else?
Nope.
I think we covered it all.
Yep. Thank you for your time.
Yeah,
It was really
thanks
good.
for the conversation.